I'm one of the lecturers here in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences, and I am a representative of Craig today because he's not very well, so apologies. It's my really great pleasure to introduce Professor Randy Parrish to give our public lecture for the Geochemistry Group meeting today. So as many of you who know Randy know that he is really influential and inspiring scientist. And not only that, but he's a great mentor, and he was, in fact, my PhD supervisor. So it's really great to get to introduce him. So I have some notes on Randy. I just asked him if he had any fun stories, but I think I'm going to stick to the official guidelines, and then he will tell you a little bit more about his career. So his career started all the way back in 1974, where he did his MSc and PhD at UBC in Vancouver in Canada. So there he really did lots of fun looking at rocks and travelling around the place and working on tectonics and metamorphic problems. And where he first started doing geochronology on some rather archaic machines, I guess. But he also, in 1981, set up the first uranium-led geochronology lab at UBC, which, yeah, it's very exciting. I'm sure Randy has lots of stories about that, which he'll tell you about later. And that ended up landing him a real job in Ottawa with the Geological Survey of Canada. So where he worked in the geochronology lab there until 1996, so really long period of time, working a lot on problems in the Canadian Cordillera, and also starting to work a bit in the Himalayas as well. So in 1996, Randy moved to NIGL, at the British Geological Survey in Keyworth, where he was head of the NERC Isotope Geosciences Laboratory, and he worked in various places in the world and was involved in loads of different projects, especially in the Himalaya, and that's also where I've worked with Randy. And also with loads of other disciplines, including environmental science, as well as uranium-led calcite dating and other technique developments. And it's also there where he began his work with the Gulf War illness, which he started in 2003. And he's done several phases of work on this project, and culminating in some work here at the University of Portsmouth. So Randy joined us in 2016, and he's been working on this project since then. So I'll let you tell.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for that generous introduction. It is my pleasure to talk to you today about really what is a much more broad topic than most geologists actually would be expected to work on. I first wanted to just ask, how many people are, just raise your hand if you're just part of the general public coming to hear this talk? Because I'd just like to know, okay, I'm not going to talk about technical things. So it's really a broad overview, really, of what you might consider actually quite a big problem, a big issue. And I got interested in this back in 2003 by, well, a paper that was published about 1999. It was brought to my attention then. And this paper basically alleged and had data to back it up that depleted uranium, which I'll explain what it is in a minute, which was used in the Gulf War of 1991, was responsible for Gulf War illness. And I was very intrigued with this idea. I thought, well, you know, it's uranium. We know how to measure uranium. Geologists are quite good at that sort of thing. Medical people, ironically, are not very good at that sort of thing. And so I just thought, well, I wonder if we can make a contribution to that sort of problem. So that's what drew me into this. But as you will realize when I take you through this story, it becomes more involved and complicated and twists and turns. It's made it quite an interesting project. All right, so really, this is all about trying to find an explanation for Gulf War illness. And I'm going to tell you what that is if you don't know. It happened a long time ago. Many of the students here were barely born at the time. But it is an important health issue. So let's just talk about first what happened in the 1991 Gulf War. Those of you who are of a certain age, like me, certainly remember this very clearly. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in late 1990, and he seized control of the oil fields of Kuwait. And he also threatened Saudi Arabia, and it took quite a few months for Allied forces to organize, sort of counterattack and do something about this. The conflict area of that part of the Middle East is in southern Iraq and Kuwait. And if you know the geography, it's basically the delta of the Euphrates River. And it includes a very large area of swampy ground that is both tidal and estuarine. And it's known to have malaria and lots of other sort of diseases and so forth. So there was concern that people might get ill, when they went to support the effort. It's also quite clearly known that Iraq had chemical weapons at the time because they had just a few years earlier finished a conflict with Iran in which chlorine gas and sarin were actually used. So what happened in January of 1991, a few months after the invasion, is that Allied forces, which consist of 35 nations, but mostly US, UK, and Canada. So we're not talking about 2003 conflict, okay? So this is like entirely pre-Tony Blair, pre-all that. This is the earlier conflict. And they counterattacked and established bases all over northern Saudi Arabia along the Kuwait-Iraqi border. There was a 5-day air war, followed by about a 5-week ground war. And then that resulted in retaking Kuwait and toppling, but it did not, it stopped short of toppling Saddam Hussein. He was still in power, but he was quickly defeated in the conflict and driven well back. Now, during that conflict, the US in particular, who were really sort of leading the effort in terms of military, they used what's called depleted uranium munitions for the first time in theater. They also present were widespread use of pesticides to basically deal with mosquitoes and things like that. They also, soldiers were obliged to take anti-nerve agent drugs because they were worried about chemical weapons. And they were also given multiple immunizations to try to protect them against disease in such a way that it happened very quickly. And really, the method of doing that had not been properly sort of fully tested. So that's a bit of the background to what happened. Now, so following the war, Gulf War illness arose as a condition. And if you don't know very much about this, it's actually quite unusual and has attracted a lot of conflicting explanations as to why it occurred. But basically, it's manifested by, as you can read here, fatigue, fever, night sweats, memory, concentration problems, pathogen, diarrhea, sexual dysfunction, body pain, lots of other symptoms that are compatible with what's called autonomic nervous system dysfunction. That basically means that the parts of your body that do things without you having to intervene. It's breathing and your muscle, things like that, and the way your brain works. So in total, it was a complicated array of symptoms that became called Gulf War illness or Gulf War syndrome. And it was very widespread. It affected up to 25% of 700,000 people who served. So there were that many people, believe it or not, who were deployed to the Gulf at the time. Now, so, a quarter of all those deployed have some sort of combination of symptoms that qualifies them as having Gulf War illness. It is not associated with the subsequent conflict in 2003. So it's not something that recurred after that conflict, all right? So that's kind of an important observation. There are tens of thousands of disability claims, so it's obviously costing governments a lot of money. So it's not a trivial condition. And also hundreds of millions have been spent, on the duty of care and research and so forth and so on. So really it's also been studied by the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society in the UK, and a lot of effort and money and time has been spent trying to find out, why this happened develop treatments, pay compensation, and so forth and so on. So it's financially, quite expensive. So let's look at the possible causes. Now, initially, nerve agents were suspected. And this is partly because there was some bombing of chemical stockpiles of nerve agents in January of 1991. I'll get back to that later on in the talk. But that explanation was actually rejected by what's called the US Defense Science Board. And they did this because there were no obvious local deaths reported. And it all went a bit quiet after that. Other possible causes included these pesticides that were widespread use of pesticides, an almost unpronounceable compound called pyridostigmine bromide, which is actually was given to soldiers to protect them against being exposed to more powerful chemical weapons or toxins. They had these multiple immunizations. Depleted uranium was used as munitions in quite a widespread way. And combat stress has also been discussed widely. Now, the latter two, immunizations and combat stress, have actually been studied quite a lot and have been largely rejected as plausible as an explanation. So we're sort of left with the pesticides, the anti-nerve agents, and things like that, as well as depleted uranium as possible explanations. Depleted uranium was never considered particularly plausible to affect that many people because its use was sort of targeted. But at the same time, it's been difficult to eliminate it as an explanation. Now, I got drawn into this work because of the uranium side of it, because I realized that, well, it's possible to test someone for exposure to depleted uranium, and I'll explain about that. And if you could do that, you could either perhaps support the case or refute the case for its relationship to Gulf War illness, or even its prevalence of contamination in theater. So I thought there's an interesting opportunity to take a geochemist, who's used to doing dating rocks in mountains and so forth, and that sort of thing, and try to apply it to a more interesting societal problem. So why should you care? Here's a couple of headlines. It's been 25 years in 2016, in January, and Gulf War syndrome is still around. There was a BBC piece done at the time, basically, why hasn't the mystery of Gulf War syndrome been solved? So although you don't hear much about it in the news, it still is a simmering issue, and it affects a lot of people in the UK. However, in some quarters in this country, the issue does seem to have gone away. And this is a paper published in 2008, some years ago, by Professor Simon Wesley and his other colleagues at King's College in London. And they have long advised the UK government on Gulf War illness. Now, Simon Wesley is a psychiatrist, and his view about this is that it's largely some sort of psychiatric illness. And that has been fairly influential, as I understand it, in the UK government. So, whether you like it or not, that is still a going explanation. So let's just think, why do we need to worry about depleted uranium? And what really might this have to do with all this? Well, lots of it were used, and I'll explain in the next slide what depleted uranium really is. But basically, they're munitions that were fired, and it's an armor-piercing munition. It was used in the conflict. More than 600 tons has been used over the last two conflicts. And it's a hazardous, radioactive metal, and when it is fired into a hard target like another tank or a building, it combusts and creates a great deal of dust and uranium oxide, and this gets dispersed, throughout the area. People have done lots of studies on depleted uranium, that involve animals, and it's been shown to be carcinogenic, teratogenic, which means it can influence the abnormalities in the birth of children, and it's also hazardous to organs. But there, in fact, are no good human health studies that involve depleted uranium. I'll explain a little bit about why that's the case. But it's also been blamed by, and it's still actively being blamed by many anti-nuclear political action groups and some scientists, for birth defects, cancers, and illness all over Iraq and the Balkans as well, and in soldiers. Now, these are some headlines that have appeared in the papers and so forth over the past number of years. So this is, and The Independent basically is quoting people in fact, Serbia or Bosnia that claim that the use of depleted uranium has actually caused many deaths and lots of cancer. And, it's a mainstream newspaper. This is the result of a court case in the UK where a soldier has died from colon cancer, and basically a court in the UK has concluded it's more likely than not he died of depleted uranium exposure. And just recently, this past year, it's not even been 1 year, but Serbia, the Royal Academy of Scientists and Artists of Serbia have basically gone political and talked about trying to file a lawsuit against NATO for the use of depleted uranium munitions in the Balkans conflict. And so, although it's not on the front page news, it is simmering in the background and has never been really resolved. So let's talk about what this stuff actually is. So depleted uranium is a form of uranium that's been through the nuclear fuel enrichment process. And this is the material that's left over after nuclear fuel enrichment. It's normally been stored as a powder, uranium fluoride, hexafluoride or UF4. But it's been, they've taken this stuff and converted it back into metal and then and fabricated basically these kind of rods out of the powdered waste from the nuclear fuel. I'll show you some, how they've stored this stuff. But basically, depleted uranium is a very dense radioactive metal. It's got 20 grams, almost 20 grams per cubic centimeter. So it's 20 times the density of water, almost. So it is very, very heavy. It's a hard metal, and it burns in the presence of oxygen, so it'll catch fire. It has a different isotope composition. Now this is important. If you're unfamiliar with what an isotope is, basically uranium contains 3 isotopes. And it's basically different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus that give uranium its different isotopes. One of them weighs 238. That's the most common. The other is 235. That's the isotope of uranium that actually is will produce fission in nuclear reactors or in bombs. And there's another very minor isotope, 234 uranium. Now, the isotopic composition, the ratio of the 238s to the 235s is very different between depleted uranium, which has a value of about 500, compared to the natural value, which is about 138. So these numbers are so large in contrast that it offers you the possibility, if you could measure this, you could easily tell if there's DU present or DU absent. And as a geochemist, that's a very big contrast and ought to be easily measured. It's often, when they fabricate these munitions, they mix it with a bit of titanium to make it more corrosion resistant. So this is how it all starts. You mine uranium from an ore body somewhere in the world. You concentrate uranium into what's called yellow cake, which is a uranium oxide material. That then goes to a conversion plant where you make it into uranium hexafluoride, which is actually a gas at room temperature, slightly above room temperature. So uranium hexafluoride is produced by the fluorination of the oxide. And this is the material, this process of making it a gas is what allows you to put it into gaseous diffusion plants or centrifuges, and that allows you to enrich the isotopes. So this is the process by which countries enrich isotopes in the 235 fissionable isotope. And for example, in recent years, everybody's been worried about Iran's ability to enrich uranium, as same in North Korea and so forth and so on. And this is what they're doing, or they're thought to be doing, enriching isotopes in the enrichment plants. That produces what's called enriched uranium, which goes into fuel fabrication and then into nuclear reactors for burning it, okay, for generating power. But to produce an X amount of nuclear reactor fuel, you have a much larger amount of depleted uranium left over. What you're doing is you're taking the 235 out of the whole thing, concentrating it, and leaving the rest of it depleted. So effectively, that depleted uranium material goes into its storage yards, effectively. And then you consider that the fuel itself is burned in a reactor. Once it is sort of finished doing its thing there, it then goes back into the enrichment cycle, where it is enriched again and recycled, okay? And we do this in the UK and so forth. But basically, the uranium that is involved in this process goes around and around. And there's an isotope of uranium called 236, and it is generated in power reactors by neutron capture. And once it's made there, it stays in the process all along. So 236, which does not occur in nature, is present in depleted uranium. And it is one of those signature forensic kind of signatures of DU. Now, these storage yards, they've decided to take this material and then reuse it by fabricating metal munitions from it that can be then used in either munitions for tanks or in different kinds of nuclear reactors. And that's also being talked about. This is a kind of photograph of what the waste, the DU waste is being stored like. Hundreds of thousands of these, well, tens of thousands of these kinds of barrels are out in the weather, rusting away, in this picture being in the United States. And so, it's logical to say, well, can this uranium be usefully used somehow? And the answer is yes. For the military people thought up, well, yes, it actually could be a very useful weapon. Now, here's what it is in terms of the military usage. Effectively, what happens is they look like this. They're fired out of tanks. And a DU munition is effectively an armor-piercing dart. It's a piece of metal, and it can penetrate steel very easily. And they're fired from tanks, from planes, and from ground weapons as well. Okay, so this just gives you an idea of what the weapons look like. Now, I've got a little picture here. I think it should work. Looks like it's going to work. All right, this is going to be a little video. And here it is being fired out of a tank. The casing comes off, and you can see the little dart there. It's flying at 1,300 meters per second. It hits a tank. There you have it. The tank barely moves because it goes into the armor so quickly. Goes in this hole, makes a fire, comes out this hole, and keeps going. Okay? So the effect of this is to basically destroy what's ever inside the tank and completely demobilize the tank. So it takes out a tank without it making a complete mess of the surrounding area. And it doesn't really generate a fire, except within the middle of the tank. So that gives you an idea of just how useful, in a military sense, DU penetrators are. They can be fired at hard targets, and they immediately will take out, a tank. And this was used in a widespread way against the Iraqi tanks, and there were hundreds of them. and it immobilized them very quickly. So in terms of that perspective, it was a very effective tool. Now, let's now just talk about the environmental and health issues of depleted uranium. What, in fact, has been done about this? What do we know? Okay, so there's something like both conflicts in the Gulf have used about 1,000 tons of this stuff. So it's quite a bit. And it's been used in southern Iraq in the first conflict, and Fallujah and various other places. But in the second conflict of 2003, it was used in Baghdad and Fallujah and all over the place. Now, it's this flawed study, this study that got me interested in this in the first place, that claimed that lots of DU is found in the urine of Gulf War veterans who had Gulf War illness. That paper tweaked my interest. It turns out that's a flawed study, and I can explain why in a minute. But basically, bioassay or urine testing programs were actually carried out by the UK Ministry of Defence. And I got involved in some of that after I started this work. And the objective was to try to find out if DU exposure happened and how much there might have been. Could you find it in urine of these soldiers? But these studies that were done in 2006 or so, which is still 15 years following the war and following any exposure, they really weren't designed to test the Gulf War illness connection at all. They just were like, do you have some DU or not? And there was a number of other major reports that were done in the early 2000s by the Royal Society, the United Nations, World Health Organization, and the US military. These are really substantial reports. So there's a lot known about DU, about the weapons, about how they're used, and what they generated, the environmental concerns, and so forth. So there's quite a lot of good background information. There was some testing, but no good real experiments to try to find out if it had anything to do with Gulf War illness. Now, I've mentioned a bioassay. A bioassay is for urine. It's effectively, you take urine and you measure some parameter that's in it. And in this case, it's basically isolate uranium that's in the urine and measure its concentration and measure its isotope composition if you can. And why would we do this? Well, if you were exposed to uranium oxide from a depleted uranium munition, then you might have breathed it into your body, or you might have ingested contaminated soil, dust, and whatever. So it gets into your lungs, and it would, if it was lodged there, if the particles are small enough, it would lodge in your lungs, and it would slowly dissolve. And it would mix with any other uranium that you have when you eat and drink food and water. And all of us do that all the time. We can't escape it. We all have uranium being ingested. Anyway, once it goes in the bloodstream, a portion of it would be absorbed preferentially into the kidneys and the bone, because those are the two reservoirs that hold most of the body's total amount of uranium. And it's because it's a phosphate mineral in your bone, and phosphates really quite like uranium chemically. And your bones, they get reprocessed over the years, and if they would, if that happens, then you would slowly release some of the uranium that was stored in your bone back into your bloodstream, go into your urine, come out your urine, and you might be able to find out if some of it that it is stored in your body is still part of the signature that you have now. And so, but the problem partly is that uranium in urine is in very low concentration. 1 to 10 parts per trillion is typical of all of us right here. Now that's not much. It is very low. Now, so I got involved in doing these kinds of tests. It's a bit messy. Most people don't want to have this kind of geological sample in their lab. They certainly don't want to have their lab looking like it's got samples like that. And that, frankly, it's one reason that there's no other lab in the world that does this sort of work. Nobody really wants to do the kind of work that we've done here at Portsmouth to do these really sensitive tests. But geochemists, like the ones in this department, are actually quite good at measuring isotope ratios using fancy mass spectrometers and trying to do things very carefully. And they actually have a lot more attention to detail than the medical community does in terms of the same kinds of tests. Medical community is used to relatively quick, instant answers. Here's your blood sample. I want the answer by the afternoon. Whereas you do this kind of work, and frankly, you're waiting months and sometimes years because it's very difficult work. But basically, we use a piece of kit. We take a sample. We take a portion of it. We do some chemical processing of it that eliminates a lot of the organic material and then concentrates the uranium and removes all the other stuff that we don't want. And then we measure the isotope composition of uranium on what are called multiple collector ICP inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometers. So these are pieces of kit that basically take the uranium that you've separated and you ionize it, and that allows you then to measure the isotope ratio. So I'm not going to talk about the technical aspects of that because it's very interesting, and I could talk about it for hours, but it would be a good formula for putting everyone to sleep, okay? Let's put it that way. But basically, just to give you a feel for it, why it's not so easy, uranium, the amount of uranium in these samples is anywhere between 0.1 and 2 nanograms. That's billionths of a gram, okay? Water itself, the drinking water that comes out of the tap, has up to 10,000 times more uranium than what uranium is in urine, okay? So you can imagine that, blimey, if I'm trying to get this uranium out of this urine sample, and I have just a tiny drop of water from the tap contaminated, I've ruined my analysis, okay? So, and also we're trying to look for this isotope 236, which is a definite signature of of reprocessed uranium. And the ratio of the main isotope uranium to 236 is 500,000. So it's like a tiny, you're looking for a tiny thing in relation to something very much bigger. You can only measure about 1 in every 200 atoms that get ionized and counted. So, you're up against it, and you've got to minimize contamination during the whole procedure. But effectively, you've got to separate and purify a billionth of a gram of uranium from 150 grams of urine that has 2 grams of salts and 5 grams of urea. So you're trying to not lose the 1 nanogram of uranium, and you're getting rid of 10 billion times that amount of other things. Okay? So that's a tricky business. Hence the emoji. All right? Okay, so now the first program I got involved in was funded by the MOD in this country, and they were concerned about people complaining about, oh, I've been exposed to DU. And this was quite widespread in the early 2000s. So they commissioned a program to several labs in this country to go demonstrate you can make these measurements. We'll fund it. Here's a bunch of samples that come from volunteers who want to be reassured they don't have DU. So we ended up measuring 378 people during this period of time, 2006 to 2008. Not a single one had DU, not one. Okay? Now, what we don't know is whether anybody was ever exposed to DU. So really, what it didn't answer the question except to say that your urine sample right now doesn't look like it has DU. That doesn't mean you weren't exposed 18 years earlier and it's worked its way through a system and we can't see it anymore. But it doesn't tell you anything about whether it's got anything to do with Gulf War illness and whatever. So it simply was kind of an exercise to reassure people who wish to be tested. That is really the first kind of big phase that I got to. Okay, I read this paper that said DU and Gulf War illness are definitely related. And I wondered, is that really true? Then you go and test all these people, and you don't find a single person that's got DU. And then you think, okay, why is that? Is that because they were exposed and it's worked its way through their system, or were they never exposed? Okay? So you either quit at that point and go back to looking at rocks, or you decide, okay, what's really needed here to move this problem forward? Because no one else was really working on this. So you need a better experiment. You need to go somewhere where people really are exposed to DU in a controlled sort of situation. And that means you can't go to Basra in Iraq. You just can't do that. The time is way too unstable. You could not possibly conduct a proper study there. But you want to have a known exposure. You want to know when that happened. You want to do a test for DU in urine. And then you want to look at, are people sick? And is it anything to do with Gulf War illness? So this is where I was at this point in time. So I thought, well, okay. I then learned about a site in the United States which fabricated these munitions. And I thought, let's go there. Let's have a look. And it turns out this is in almost in the middle of Albany, New York. Raise your hand if you've been to Albany, New York. Surely somebody's been there. Several people, okay? This is about 1 mile from the State University, just across the motorway. This was a plant run by a company called National Lead Industries. And you'd think most people who lived nearby thought they made paint. But in fact, they had been processing metals, including lead, cadmium, uranium, and all sorts of other things for the past 70 or 80 years. So this whole area was really badly contaminated. But in this plant, they did, what they did is they took the uranium hexafluoride barrels. They came in. They then had basically a foundry where they would mix this stuff with magnesium salts, heat it up to very high temperature. That caused magnesium fluoride to form, and in combination with uranium metal. So you make a metal and a salt. And that is how they got the uranium metal. Then they took the metal, remelted it, fabricated it into munitions and all sorts of other things. So what the timeline here is that munitions and other products were made in the plant from 1968 to 82. And prior to 68, enriched uranium was processed where they made nuclear fuel rods. Now, this is just a photograph of what's called the chip burner in the plant. The chip burner is fantastic, okay? If you want a good experiment, this is it. What they did was they've got a shop floor, and they have lots of metal lathes. So they're fabricating cylinders of depleted uranium. And when you do that with lathes, you have lots of turnings. If you've seen like little pieces of metal that get scraped off, and generally they're falling on the floor. People sweep them up. And it turns out they had some fires. And the fires result from having very finely divided pieces of uranium in contact with oxygen, and it self-ignites. So when you had a big pile of this stuff, you'd actually have a few fires. And they said, well, how can we prevent the fires? So they thought up the good idea that if they put these metal turnings in barrels of oil, it would prevent them from being in contact with oxygen. Turns out the oil they used was PCB oil. PCBs are now a completely banned substance, cancer-causing. But they basically did that. And PCBs is the material that was used in transformers, okay, in power lines and things. So they didn't have filters on these things, and they tended to clandestinely burn this stuff at night. And smoke clouds would come up, and it would fall on the neighborhood and so forth. And they were in flagrant violation of lots of regulations. They only had a filtration system from the late 70s, and there was a huge amount of particulate emissions. It was closed in 1984. The US federal government bought the whole plant for $1, took all their liability, hush hush, and then spent $190 million cleaning the place up. So it's one of these companies that does things for the military infrastructure, and the government effectively assumes responsibility no matter what happens. So that's really the story of National Lead Industries in Colony, New York. This is a picture of what it looks like now. It's been cleaned up. It looks like a park, although I don't think you're allowed to go in there. But you can see that really loads of people live around this site in very close proximity and have done so for many, many decades. Okay, so I thought this would be a great project. And I thought this would be, in particular, a great project for a PhD student who would be, take this on and be energetic about doing this kind of thing. And I figured that if we went to this kind of area and you were nice to people and, talked to the local people who, in fact, were interested in this issue, and they did know about the uranium work here, that you could go into their houses, you could take soil samples, plant samples, all sorts of things, and try to document how much DU is around. So I was extremely fortunate to recruit this guy, Nick Lloyd, who actually, many of you now know, works for Thermo Fisher selling mass spectrometers. And he was one of the best students I ever had. And this is him as a young boy. He looks a bit older now. But this is what the sort of territory looks like. It's a working class neighborhood. We took soil samples. We went into people's garages and attics and so forth and basically sampled dust that had accumulated for decades and been undisturbed. So, and it was absolutely a great project. It was a treasure trove of information. So this is a result of some of Nick's work, and he did an absolutely smashing job. This is lots of samples around the site, and the color codes are the concentrations of uranium. Now, normal soil has maybe 5 parts per million uranium in the soil. And here, in fact, it was very sandy soil, and the background is really about 1 or 2. But these concentrations go up to 3,500. So it's very high around the plant. And this is a direct result of the emissions through the stack that were unregulated. He also not just measured concentration, he measured isotope ratios, and this is an isotope ratio map. He looked at soil profiles, and you can see it's high at the surface and it tails off as you go down. He just did a lot of really, really nice work. The other thing he did was he actually separated the dust particles from the soil and from the dust in people's houses. And you can find these particles of uranium oxide on the right. And these are typical shapes that you produce when you combust uranium. And I show you by comparison, on the left, particle shapes that have been observed and described from DU tank firings, where they've done experiments. And they're all the same kind of things. You basically fire DU, you burn it. It's about the same thing. It produces a dust. And you produce these balls, some of which are hollow, and lots of weird shapes. But basically, the idea is it's quite oxidized. So Nick then, on his own initiative, went to what's called the diamond light source, which is a synchrotron near Harwell. And he arranged to have some of these particles analyzed for their oxidation state. And he plots a lot of them here, and it turns out that they're almost all either uranium U3O8 or UO2. And these are the most oxidized forms of uranium, and they are the least soluble. These are the kinds of compounds that you actually see in nature in uranium ore deposits. So they last a long time, hence the fact they're still in the soil. They haven't dissolved away, and they're still present. They have partly dissolved, but not fully. Okay, so the other thing he did, which is very clever, very, very clever, is he wrote he did a freedom of information action. He wrote to get information from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the US. He said, I want you to tell me what are the isotope composition of the depleted uranium waste that you've measured over the period of your operation during the entire history of uranium enrichment. And believe it or not, they actually provided the information. So the information is that everything in blue are the actual compositions, and they've got dates on them. And this is a plot of the 2 different pairs of isotopes of uranium. So this, you don't have to, I'm not going to explain this in detail, but the point is natural uranium lies on the bottom line somewhere out in the field over there. So it's way over there. It's got a value of about 7 times 10 to minus 3. So it's way over here. And depleted uranium is predominantly here, but it's got other compositions all over the place. So he was able to match single particles of dust that he'd measured to different periods of time that came from the enrichment plants in Oak Ridge. I just thought that was a very, very clever thing to have done. The next phase that so what we've done is we said, okay, here's a place that's loads of uranium around. You could not possibly have avoided breathing this dust if you lived in the area. And we thought, well, let's test people if they're willing, and we did. So the first study that we did showed that about 15% of all the people who were local residents but not workers in the plant had DU in their system, not much, but a little bit, and we could determine that. Everybody who was a worker had been badly contaminated, very high concentrations, and they still have it 25 years later. This led another group in New York. I think they're slightly shamed into maybe they should do it too on a bigger study. But I worked with these people. They're very nice people, and they wanted to actually do this study. But it took a long time for them to do it. But basically, they did many more people, about 130 people instead of only 30. And they found almost identically the same thing. About 15% of residents you could find were DU positive in their urine. And all the workers were very anomalous with high concentrations. So the conclusions largely were the same regardless of the two studies. So now what we've determined is that if you combust DU, you're mainly going to produce an oxide that's not very soluble. If people are significantly exposed, you can still find it 25 to 35 years later in their urine. You can model this, and the biologists do this, and medical people do this, and you can kind of back calculate how much they were exposed to if you know the time of exposure, and you know how much they excrete now. And it suggested that people were exposed to either gram to milligram quantities, depending on whether you were a worker in the plant or you were a local resident who was contaminated. We could trace the source of these particles and the dust back to the enrichment plant. And we also know there were higher cancer rates in the local area. But there was no decent health study that was done. Even though they spent $200 million cleaning the place up, nobody could be bothered to do a health study for a fraction of that, which is in a way, tragic, because a lot of people are really getting on now, and people are dying from other reasons. So they're losing an opportunity to make a really good health study there. So summarizing, what do we know? DU and other toxins were present in the Gulf War of 1991. And Gulf War illness affects 25% of all those who served. That's almost 250,000 people, but not the later conflict. Bioassay testing shows little or no DU, but exposure is not known or is quantifiable for the soldiers. No geochemical studies into DU contamination were ever done in Iraq or Kuwait, unfortunately. So the extent of contamination there is simply not known. Where DU is quantifiable and known, you can find it in urine for the rest of your life, pretty much. No health studies were ever done in DU-contaminated areas, but it remains a factor in Gulf War illness as a possible cause, although it's not the most likely cause. But it could be playing some sort of a role. So that was sort of the third phase in this whole project. That takes us up to about, well, let's just say 6 years ago. So at this point in time, I thought, well, if you want to solve the Gulf War illness problem, you've got to go to Gulf War veterans, people who are properly diagnosed, been well studied, they've got the condition. And then you're going to go and test them. And if you can test them based on what we've learned already about how long a contaminant lasts in your body, how easy it is for us to find it later on, we should be able to either find it or eliminate it as a cause. So I then contacted this gentleman, Robert Haley, in Texas. And he's been studying Gulf War illness veterans for 25 years at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. A very nice chap and thoroughly Texan. But anyway, he's had lots of funding to continue these studies over many years. In fact, some supported by the US government, the Institutes of Health, but others were supported by a billionaire named Ross Perot. I'm sure some of you have heard of him, okay? He ran for president unsuccessfully as an independent some years ago, but he was very concerned about soldiers and veterans and looking after them after they serve. So he actually funded some of Haley's work. Now, Haley is not the only person who's studied Gulf War illness people, of course, but he has done some very systematic studies involving thorough studies and CT scans and lots of tests over many periods of time, many years, and he's followed people for a long time, the same sort of cohort. And he's also identified a variety of symptoms or syndromes, all of which involve brain abnormalities. And he's done this by imaging CT scans. Now, one of the things he did, which is really particularly interesting, and it hasn't been done very often by any other researchers, and no one in Britain, as far as I know, has done this, but basically they've done brain scans before to look at what's happened to their brains. Are they anomalous? Do they have abnormalities? And then they have given them what's called toxic challenges. A toxic challenge is effectively taking a compound much, much more weak or dilute. A toxic compound, you give it to people. It's almost like an immunization, you know, for whether it be MMR or whatever. You're basically giving people a little bit of the bad stuff. And the idea with immunization is it protects you later on. But here, basically, it causes an effect that's small. And he looked at the effect on the brains after these challenges and compared that to the kind of abnormalities that are already present in the brain. And he found that organophosphate compounds that were used in these toxic challenges are a likely explanation because they make sense. But there are several of them. Believe it or not, pesticides. You know, how many of you have used Roundup on your weeds? Okay, that is one of the pesticides. That is, it's an organophosphate compound, and most pesticides are like this. That's the type of compounds they are. The pyridostigmine bromide is also an organophosphate compound, but also, in a much more dangerous category, are chemical weapons. Sarin, for example, is a very strong organophosphate toxin. And the Novichok things that have been in the news in the last several years in Salisbury, they also are organophosphate compounds, but they're very much more powerful. So what he has been doing for years is doing a case control study of 154 people. They've got 40 controls. And the controls are people who are otherwise similar but never served. They weren't deployed to the Gulf, but they're military people, otherwise very similar backgrounds. So, and of those that are not controls, all of them have Gulf War illness, and they were all deployed in the conflict, and they were there for the air war and the ground war. So the controls do not have the symptoms, and all the others do, and all of them were serving in the military in 1991, though some never went to the Middle East, okay? And those are the controls. And he's brought them back virtually every year back to his hospital to do tests and so forth. So what I did was I began this work some years ago at where I was previously before I came to Portsmouth. But I basically, there were some difficulties with the work there. And having moved down to this region here at Portsmouth, I thought, you know, I'm going to start it over here and do it again. And so I obtained aliquots of urine samples of all these individuals. The urine was collected around 2010, so it was like 9 years ago. It's been sitting in bottles for 9 years. But I brought the material here after I developed the techniques, and we did the work here in the labs that are on this floor. The chemical labs are on this floor and the mass specs down in the lower floor. And we're just about ready to publish the paper, but the results are incredibly clear. So it's taken me years to produce the next slide. Okay, so I'm just so that you realize, it's like, this is it. Okay, this is it. This is it. This is everything. This is years of work.
Not even in colour.
No, sorry. All right, so let's see. What have we got here? Concentration. This is a logarithmic chart, and what's being on the y-axis is nanograms uranium per gram of creatinine. Creatinine is a metabolic waste compound that all our bodies produce it. We all produce about 2 grams of this every day, and it ends up in our urine. Okay? And basically, the medical community likes to express a metal as a ratio to grams creatinine because it evens out the fact that some people might drink 10 pints at the pub one day and then take a urine sample, and the next person might only drink 1. And so it basically corrects for the concentration bias that all of us might have, depending on what we eat and drink in an average day. So the concentrations go from a fraction of 1 nanogram per gram all the way up to about 60, but mostly it's about 2 or 3 or 4. And that is very, very typical of the average population. There's nothing unusual about it whatsoever. Then the isotope ratios. Okay, these are 2 diagrams that summarize the same thing. This is the ratio of 238 to 235. Now I'm telling you that the natural value is 137.8. And that is right there. So the black line is the mean of all of these, but it's 137.57 plus or minus 0.09. So it's within error of all natural samples, effectively. And there is a slight amount of natural variation, but it's quite slight. And this is just 154 measurements. Now, I don't know which ones are cases and which ones are controls. They're all there, and there's no difference between any of them. So it really doesn't matter whether it's a case or a control. They're all the same. They don't differentiate in terms of concentration or isotope ratio. And this is an interesting diagram for those of you who are in the department, perhaps attended the workshop. This is what's called a linearized probability diagram. And the probability is from 0.01 to 99.9. And basically, I've plotted every measurement with its own uncertainty bar. And the line that passes through all of them, there are no exceptions. When that happens, what that means is that the measurements are behaving as if this is a completely homogeneous population. It's a homogeneous isotope composition, and you're simply measuring the same thing 154 times. And it's behaving statistical laws in the sense that there's 1 or 2 measurements of the whole lot that are what we call outside 2 standard deviations. There's about 7 or 8 that fall outside 2 standard deviations, and 67% of all of them are in 1 standard deviation. Okay, so it's just normal Gaussian statistics. If you measure something over and over and over again, this is the way it will look if it's the same thing. So effectively, any DU, I never found any 236 uranium in any sample either. So, you know, it's pretty boring work, you might say. Every measurement ends up being the same. So what do we now know? Just to recap, if you were exposed to DU, we'd find it in your urine, and we'd find it up to 35 years later. Gulf War illness affects a lot of people who served in the conflict. And make no mistake, if we had actually a method to assess Gulf War illness in the Iraqi population, it would be there in spades, I'm sure. And that's the collateral exposure to some sort of toxin. No DU is found in any of the Gulf War illness positive cohort. That will be, in a way, no surprise in some quarters, because you wouldn't expect very many people at all to be exposed to DU, because it's fired at a tank. A few people around that might get exposed. A few people might get shrapnel or something like that, but basically it's not going to affect the vast majority of people that are somewhere else. So if you can't find any DU in that cohort, then you can, and you know that if you were exposed, you'd find it a long time afterwards, then you can pretty much eliminate DU as a cause or a risk factor for Gulf War illness. So that is the fundamental conclusion I've got here. So the implied health concerns about DU in the Balkans, in Serbia, in Iraq and so forth and so on, where people have tried to say, well, that's cancer that's caused that, it's DU, it's, that sort of thing, it's radioactive. All these things, to me, in my opinion, is completely unfounded, and they're all exaggerated. And they're not based on any factual evidence. So therefore, Gulf War illness has got to be something else. So what is it going to be? All right, so I'm going to take you back to some of Haley's work. And he worked with a meteorologist, ex-Army, ex-security type person. And they looked at meteorological patterns that took place on the night and the 2 days following the bombing by US forces, where they actually destroyed 2 chemical weapons caches. So they took out 2 sites where Saddam Hussein had been storing chemical weapons. And they bombed it, and it created a great fire. And everyone knew that. The military knew this at the time, but basically nobody died in the local area. And they said, well, that's got nothing to do with Gulf War illness, because nobody's died. But what James Tuitt and Robert Haley did was they looked at this whole pattern again. So let me explain the diagram. Here's Iraq. Most of the war took place down here in southern Iraq. These are all the blue dots were locations of military units on the 19th of January, 1991. They're all over this part of the world and out here in the Gulf in ships. Now, everywhere you see, this is the chemical weapons facilities were up here, Fallujah and at Mutana, northwest of Baghdad. And the little green beaker symbol, which is here, here, down here, these are sites where chemical weapons monitoring equipment was installed and where the alarms went off. Okay? So you had alarms about chemical weapons sensitive detectors were going off all through this part of the world within a day of this bombing. And they looked at the weather patterns and so forth, and the prevailing winds were in this direction to the south, and it was spreading out. There was a large, because there was a lot of bombing here at the time, a large sort of cloud of smoke and dust and so forth was circulating, and it moved southwards and so forth. So one might ask, well, why was this cause dismissed in 1994 by the US military because they didn't kill anybody? Does that mean that it was, harmless? Okay, so what they did is they did an analysis of what happens when you, bomb something, it creates a fire. So basically, we've all seen the mushroom cloud type thing, whether on atomic weapons scale or a smaller scale. And this is created by a thermal plume from the explosion. So it destroys all the material. It is in a fire. It gets carried high up into the atmosphere. At some point, just like thunderclouds, they reach a point where they're no longer buoyant, and then they get blown whatever direction, downwind, is present. And they've modeled this, and basically it rises. They did this bombing at night, and at night the air is more still, and things were carried downwind, and by noon the next day, when you have this thing starting to recirculate again, once the sun comes up, you get convection, and it mixes this layer again, and it basically brings some of that material back to the surface. So they produced an analysis that made it entirely plausible that although there was no necessarily any significant toxic exposure in this area, that there had to be down here because the alarms were going off. And they produced the arguments that were based in meteorology that made this sensible. So effectively, it's I think, inescapable that hundreds of thousands of people, both civilian and military, were exposed to non-lethal sarin exposure. And this is what Haley and Tuitt said in their papers. And it's, they suggest that because sarin they've tested things in their toxic challenge experiments, they've shown that sarin is a very plausible toxin that produces effects that are similar to what many of these people have in their brains, the abnormalities and so forth. So basically, they had already established that it was plausible that sarin was. So where does that leave us with all of this? Okay, so these are all, this is the, you might say, the news that is still going on about this issue of DU and Gulf War illness. Okay, let's just go through them. These children had cancer, now they're dead. I believe they're killed by depleted uranium. That's clearly false. Why hasn't the mystery of Gulf War syndrome been solved? Well, it possibly has been solved, but nobody's paid attention to a scientific paper. Gulf War syndrome hasn't gone away. Well, these guys think so, but no, it hasn't gone away. Soldier dies from exposure of depleted uranium during Gulf War, and judge says so in court. Likely that's a very unsafe conclusion. I see 300 graves died of depleted uranium, probably entirely false. 15 tons of depleted uranium used in Serbia, we're going to sue NATO. Well, they're not going to have much luck doing that. I think they will struggle. I think it's basically a politically motivated action. Now, I think really a lot of this stuff, you might say, well, what do you believe when you read media reports these days? And it's quite, you know, as an informed citizen, one needs to be skeptical, but objective about what you're reading, what you think makes sense, and so forth and so on. And remember that the whole paper that got me into this was this study that said, oh, we've measured all these things with DU. We've measured the urine. There's DU all over the place. These people have Gulf War illness. Okay, the problem with that paper is that I was asked by the UK High Court to investigate their methods and assess the extent to which I felt that those measurements were reliable. And it turns out that they had been using as a solution in the laboratory for, you might say, quality assurance, a concentrated solution of depleted uranium. So, you know, it's not difficult to imagine that if you have a laboratory, you've got a bottle here of concentrated depleted uranium, and you were measuring it probably every 10 times you measure anything. Oh yes, we still get the right answer for the DU. And then they go and measure all these samples, and the labware gets mixed up, and it doesn't get completely cleaned, and cross-contamination is a highly likely scenario for that paper. And we were able to prove this because some of the urine samples of one individual who actually was tested was recovered. It was measured again by 2 labs, and we both got natural uranium. So, and it had previously been registered as DU, and it was the same urine sample. And so we were able to show that paper was completely flawed, unfortunately. Anyway, it just goes to show that careful measurements really are really important if you want to solve a problem where the issue is important, carries a lot of significance, but also where the measurements are really tough, and cross-contamination is the biggest problem that could possibly happen. So it's really tricky. So the people here at Portsmouth have been very good to me in letting me do this study. But I'm really happy with the conclusions because it's a very clean outcome of the whole study. Now, just before I end, I'll just say that in the red box here really is some of the things to look. What do we need to look forward about? Well, in the Syrian war, we know sarin was used. This is the Office for the Prevention of Chemical Weaponry, and they studied this after there was a chemical weapon attack, and they said it's sarin that is actually used there. And if you recall, I can't remember exactly when this was, but President Trump ordered the destruction of part of the air base, which was adjacent to this facility where they contained where these chemical weapons were thought to be stored. And I found this quote in an article that basically says the U.S. deliberately avoided bombing sarin stockpiles at this air base, and they may have done that. I mean, it's quite possible that they did pay attention to some of his work. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.